Hi, I'm Katie, and this is the Free Art and Design School podcast, web series, whatever. And I have yet another wonderful guest if you'd like to introduce yourself.
My name is Chris Fritton, and for about the last 10 years, I've been doing a project called the Itinerant Printer.
Which is amazing and one of my favorite projects. And I thought we could talk a little bit about what got you into printing and how you started and your journey with the project.
Yeah, it actually started really early for me. I've always been into skateboarding and punk rock, and from the time I was like 11 or 12 years old, I was making a lot of handmade zines, just cut and pasted together, photocopied at Kinko's and places like that. And then I would staple them together and give them out for free. But eventually I looked for ways to improve those. So I learned how to screen print, and I would screen print the covers, but I would still digitally print the inside. And then eventually I found letterpress printing. And when I found letterpress printing, there was something about it that it was so deeply involved in the language itself, sort of composing the language where when you arrange every letter and every word in every single sentence, it makes you feel like you're kind of building the language from the inside out. So there was this element of it that was like the architecture of language, kind of like brought to life, really tangible. So when I learned how to letterpress print, it was the same thing where I was still just using it as the cover, kind of printing for my own chapbooks and things like that. I eventually started printing entire books. I learned how to hard case books. And then I used to run a place in Buffalo, New York, which is where I'm from, called the Western New York Book Art Center. And it was a shared studio space, a community center where we would teach people how to letterpress print and screen print and bookbind and do paper marbling and paper making and all kinds of other things. And what I realized after running that space as the studio director for about 8 years is that I knew everything about my own space, but nothing about anyone else's. And I never really had a journeyman time in my career. So I started reading all these accounts of what they called tramp printers or itinerant printers, people that would just have a union card and they could travel all around North America and pick up a job. So they'd work in Cleveland for a couple of weeks and quit, and move to Cincinnati and work there for a couple of weeks and quit and move on to the next place. And I got super fascinated with this idea that they were living this nomadic lifestyle, but they were also earning their keep as they went. They were actually getting paid. There's no longer a typographical union. I couldn't really expect anybody to pay me a wage. So what I did with the Itinerant Printer project is a lot like a mid-level touring band. So I set up a system whereby I could travel from place to place. I would print using the presses that those people had, as well as the equipment that they had, and the things that I made along the way essentially became the merch that I sold. So just like a mid-level touring band, as long as I was touring, I was making money and I'd be able to make it to the next place and go to the next place and so on and so forth. And all told, it's almost been a decade now that I've been doing the project, but I covered almost all 48 contiguous states, 4 Canadian provinces. At this point, I've traveled to over 200 print shops. I've probably covered close to 200,000 miles by plane and car and train. And I've made over 35,000 prints on the road. So
Great.
it all kind of like came from that tiny little kernel of DIY and punk and skateboarding, and making those little zines that led me into what was kind of like cut and paste bookmaking, continued on as I tried to improve those. I just like fell into letterpress printing in a really organic way, and then hit the road and decided to see how everyone else operated in their studios and try to learn about their equipment and their workflow and things like that. So really it was about like expanding that knowledge, but funding my own journeyman time in my career too.
What was most surprising about how other people run their shops? Because no two shops are the same or run the same.
I think that for me, it was the regional sort of aspects to it. So when I would travel down south, there'd be certain things that print shops there would have. And then when I'd travel up north, there'd be things that print shops there had. Really good example of that. I felt like I would always express this when I was on the road and talking to other people and students too, is um, when you're up north, everyone uses Scotch tape for make ready, for making things ready to print. So these tiny, thin, uh, what I would say, the tape that you use to wrap a present with, you know. And I'd get down south and I'd be like, hey, do you guys have Scotch tape, you know? And they would always just be like, what? And I'd be like, you know, Scotch tape, like clear tape, like the tape, you know. And they would always be like, I don't know, I have painter's tape or something. And I'd be like, what? And but they would always have baby wipes down there, and I thought that was like really genius because baby wipes have just a little bit of baby oil on them, and it can be used as a solvent. So
Mhm.
instead of running to the bathroom or to the sink every 30 minutes or every 30 seconds to like wash your hands, you could use baby wipes. Like,
Oh
this
my
is
God.
genius, you know. And then I get back up north and nobody has baby wipes. It's just sort of like something that, you know, didn't really occur to anyone or hadn't been shared. So what I started doing was buying Scotch tape everywhere I went in the South and leaving it behind at the print shops.
Oh my
And
God.
then I'd buy baby wipes when I was up north, and I would leave it behind at the print shops. So in this way, I became like a Johnny Appleseed of information. And that's super similar to how the older tramp printers or itinerant printers operated too. They became these analog conduits for information. So as they went from place to place, they'd bring tips and tricks about printing, but they'd also bring rumors where it was just like, did you hear this guy died? You know, this two companies merged. This company went out of business. That was the only way that information was traveling prior to radio and television. It was really one of the fastest ways that it was traveling was simply word of mouth. So anytime the tramp printers, or what they used to just call travelers, came into town, they brought all that information with them too.
I think
And I didn't really think it would be like part of my trip, but then I ended up with Scotch tape and baby wipes and who knows what else, you know. Um, and it was really cool though, because essentially, if you think about it, it's like this nomadic skill sharing thing too. So people would leave that with me, and I was able to kind of take it to the next place.
I think that's awesome because now sort of the only way that most places exchange information is digitally, but I think digital communication really loses um, the human quality of like face-to-face interaction, and especially in something as tactile as the printing community. Like, having people in different places is like crazy important, not only for, like you said, news or like sharing information or how to teach people to do things, but also like your personal um, growth and enjoyment as a printer. Could you talk a little bit about like maybe some of the more like not spiritual, but like in terms of like your practice and how it's grown and changed over time, how that journey has like affected your like work and your philosophy on making work?
Well, first, I definitely think you're totally right that there's this strange presumption, especially in small communities, niche communities like letterpress. Maybe there's only a few thousand of us like printing, is that everyone knows what everyone else is up to
Mm,
because we're connected digitally now. And what I found out right away on the trip is that that wasn't the case at all, that
mm,
all those people were still operating in these silos. So I was able to become that sort of like human ligament that connected them that I didn't know that they needed. I always give this example of the first shop that I visited being, you know, 10 or 12 miles down the road from the next stop. And I get to the next stop and I'm like, hey, I was just down here. And they were like, what? Where? And I
my
was like
God.
so taken aback. I was like, you have to be kidding me. I was like, this isn't possible. You're 10 miles apart and you're doing the exact same thing. And I made the assumption that everybody in the letterpress community really knew what everyone else was up to, and it was not the case, you know. So I think there is something to be said for this really humanistic view. And I also think that no matter how many tutorials are out there, there's still something about being shown something in person that's just far more efficient and far more efficacious. It might take me 2 seconds to show you in real life, and it might actually take like a 15-minute tutorial on
Yeah.
YouTube. And I just feel like the 2 seconds is the way to go, you know, then
Yeah.
you can move on to the next thing.
Especially with printing, like
Yeah,
it,
absolutely.
yeah.
I feel like I saw a lot change in my own practice. I think that when I set out, I imagined everything that I was making to be like very precious.
Mm,
And that's a little bit a symptom of the work that I was doing prior, where I was doing sort of more like artist books and
mm,
really meticulous things, where they were meant to be precious objects. And then I headed out on the road and I did 4x6 postcard size pieces and sometimes 12 by 18 poster size pieces. And those postcards would get sent back to people from the road. So if you pitched in a little bit of money, you'd get 5 postcards from the road, and you never knew where they were going to come from. It was like a grab bag. And the poster work was the same way. That ended up like being my merch, like I was talking about. And I still do that when I hit the road. I still try to make things when I'm at other people's shops. But I thought of them as so precious. I was literally like, these are going to be limited editions. I'll number and sign every single one. You know, I only made 50 of these. And I literally had a spreadsheet where I kept track of every
Wow.
single print that I made, how many I made, how many colors it was, you know. Um, and I got to tell you, after like a month of being on the road and tossing everything like in my trunk in the back seat and then spreading it on a table and having these little pop-up sales and all these other things, that was just gone. I didn't give a shit anymore, honestly. Like they were just posters that went into boxes
Yeah.
and then they came out and that was it. You know, it lost all of the preciousness like for me, and not in a bad way, in a
Yeah.
way that I felt like really comfortable with. Um, my friend Amos Kennedy was someone that I spent some time with early on when I started printing. And one of his mentors always said this thing to him that I liked, where it was put the message in the hands of the people and move on. And
Mm,
it's, you know, about that not really dwelling on something being perfect, having it being good enough, and then getting it into the hands of the people and moving on to the next thing. And it's not about not striving to have it be perfect, but it's also about thinking about the job that piece is going to do. And when I would see those postcards after they had gone through the mail and they were absolutely just racked, but people still loved them and, like, you know, put them on the fridge and hung them on their door and stuff, I was like, that's still doing the job.
yeah.
It's still like bringing that sort of little tiny bit of joy into somebody's mailbox and then into their day. It didn't matter that it was perfect. It didn't matter that it was like a precious object. It's precious in a different way, which is about its activity as opposed to its objectivity.
I think one of the things that makes letterpress really special, especially like wood type, is that you're so limited by like the amount of characters that you can use, and
Mhm.
the size of the paper that you can use. So it forces you to be pithy and like share a like sort of boiled down truth. And then like I
Mhm.
have like a bunch of stuff on my wall. Like when you have a letterpress piece that's like on your wall that you're looking at every day, like it really does sink in. And I think a lot of the quotes that you've been doing, I don't know how long you've been doing like the quote projects that you've been doing, whether that started early on or whether that's been like a more recent thing. But I think they're really powerful because you're sort of like distilling this wisdom. And I know like Karita Kent did stuff like that, which wasn't letterpress, but was still like part of her practice. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that work.
Yeah, there's so many aspects of that that I really love, and I'm glad that you keyed into them. I think that one of the interesting things that I did early on, especially when I was making my own poetry chapbooks and I was setting all of the type, is that I would actually edit right out of the typecase.
Oh
So
my
I would
God.
have a poem in front of me and I would say, this is what I'm going to set. And I would get halfway through the line and I would immediately be like, I don't need that word. And it wasn't like out of laziness, it was about spending so much more time with the line. If you can imagine, I'm just punching it up in Microsoft Word or Pages or whatever. Um, it's very quick and I might not think about it as much. But when I was editing out of the typecase, I'd have to spend 2 or 3 minutes maybe on each line. And after those 2 or 3 minutes, you're just like, sometimes you'd be like, this is trash, or like, this is not doing the job that I thought it was going to do, you know? So I really started to pare it down. And that was an amazing experience to see the poems or the things I was writing get shorter and shorter, but still be as effective or maybe more effective. And then it was the same way. I'm glad you brought up Karita Kent. There's a lot of other people that I've admired for a long time, whether it be Jenny Holtz or other people that are putting out these things that feel very condensed, very compressed, like you just described, but at the same time, very expansive
Mhm.
and very large and very meaningful. Um, I like to choose things or write things for my own sort of like quote posters that feel like they're right on the precipice of being cheesy and being profound.
Yeah.
And I am definitely self-aware enough that I understand that's what I'm doing. And that is, you know, a symptom of those people that I admired, but it's also about what you just described is when you see that thing on your wall day after day after day, it becomes like a mantra. But at one point, it actually moves from being like a mantra to a little bit more of like a Zen koan,
Yeah.
where maybe it like loses all of its meaning because you've seen it too many times. And then it regains like a different meaning.
Yeah.
And
Or
you
like a
can
feeling, not even a meaning, just like
absolutely
resonant thing.
right. You can empty that thing out of its sort of like intellectual meaning and come to it maybe with like a little bit more of like an emotional meaning. Um, and I see that happen all the time, you know. It's just like when you read a word too many times or hear it too many times and it no longer sounds or looks like a word. That can happen to phrases and sentences and everything as well. So I think I'm striving for that a lot of times. Um, and I like to make it clear to people that what I'm doing, I understand enough about why I'm doing it and who my audience is, that it's not really like live, laugh, lovey,
No.
and it's not meant to be. But when the quote comes close to that, I just want you to spend like a little bit more time with it
Yeah.
because it'll probably go through the event horizon and out the other side, and you'll see it kind of like become a different thing, you know. My entire background is in poetics, so the philosophy of poetry. So my first degree and then my master's degree, it's all in writing and poetics. So I came to letterpress printing as a writer and more of like a book artist and a zinester, as opposed to as a printer by vocation, like some other people did, or as an artist. Really no formal training in art or studio art. So
So that's why you and James get along so well.
yeah, I think so too. Where it's like you come at it from this outsider's perspective and you're able to be free. I think a lot of the constraints that you get taught in that space, you know, where let's just take a super simple example that I'd probably never, you know, transverse, but it would be like there's only use three typefaces or something, you know. It's like I'm not bound by those because I didn't spend hours sitting in design classes with other people. There's also a danger to that too. I mean, what I've said that I'm lucky I always had a bunch of older, even union printers as mentors, even if they were haphazard mentors, because they were able to teach me about the craft of letterpress printing. So I was always trying to come at it from an artistic perspective, but I respect the craft of it as well. And what I always tell students when I'm talking to them is that you need to learn the rules in order to break them with grace.
Mm,
That's the space that you have to be in. I think to do those things successfully as well as have a repeatable success.
yeah.
So I didn't just want to come in, you know, great balls of fire, absolutely trying to destroy everything about letterpress printing. It was way more like, okay, let me learn everything about that, unlearn it, come back to it, and then see what on earth the things I was making looked like after that.
I think that makes a lot of sense and explains your sort of unique aesthetic. You have these beautiful bright colors and washes and everything you do. I have one of your pieces on my wall. Where is it? It's the tiny, it's this like very colorful one
I
that
can
I
see
got
it.
from you when I got the watch. And I was wondering if you could talk about like how you came to your particular aesthetic because it feels in a lot of ways like more contemporary than a lot of letterpress. I know that's funny. Letterpress is such an old um, wonderful medium, but how do you like keep things so kind of fresh in your work?
I think that you're right in envisioning it almost in a reactionary way, where I saw all this traditional letterpress and everything was black and everything was red and everything was like these really sort of saturated, simple, plain, and traditional colors. And I said, well, how can I maybe do that exact same kind of work, but modernize it? And the simplest thing before I understood more about form was just to adjust the palette. So if I was able to adjust the color, I could take something that was apparently traditional and make it look modern almost immediately. And then after that, it really just became uh, kind of something that I clung to because it's the palette that I know the most about. So if you were to throw me a bunch of earth tones or something right now, I wouldn't be able to produce a very successful piece because I don't know much about the way they interact. I could over time, but I know so much about these colors after working with them for 15 years or so that I know what they're going to do. And at least it takes like one small variable out of the equation for me. So I think that that's one of the reasons. One of the other reasons is because a lot of the early work that I was doing when I finally got to move into like large scale design and maybe away from more book work that I was doing was a lot of gig posters for bands. And I always felt like if something didn't kind of slap you in the face from across the room, it probably wasn't doing its job.
Yeah.
That was really the way I viewed it. I wanted it to sort of like visually assault you in a way so that you would want to know more about it and go walk across the room and say, what is that? So it's always been the bright colors. I actually had an idea during the Itinerant Printer project that I would go and use a different palette for each region of the country. So
That's
down in the
cool.
southeast, it would be like, I don't know, teal and mauve and kind of like Miami style colors. And then the southwest, it would be earth tones. And then Pacific Northwest, it'd be jewel tones. And I tried that on the second leg of the trip in the southwest. And the first like two or three prints I made were just terrible. They were like just visual failures. And I remember being like so disappointed that
Oh,
the larger notion that I had just kind of fallen apart.
yeah.
Um, but then also really trying to accept it and just being like, all right, here's one of the things that's also going to make 200 prints when I put them on the wall at the end of the day sort of continuous is that they share a palette. Like that'll be it.
Yeah.
So it ended up working out. I think at this point in time, I've actually had a sort of allergy recently to like color, and I've been doing some black and white work where I feel like I just fell out of love with it or got burnt out on it or felt as though I had done as much as I could maybe for a little while until something else comes to me. So some of the most recent prints I've done are black and white.
Wow. But
Yeah.
that's, I don't know, it makes sense. I think what you're talking about is like so key to the main struggle of being an artist, which is like developing a style, but having enough flexibility within that style to like not entertain yourself, but to not get bored. And I feel like there are a lot of forces in sort of contemporary society, mostly social media and like corporate America, that sort of force media creators on like TikTok or Instagram to just make the same thing over and over once they're successful and then not have any sort of creativity within that like small spectrum. And I think it's admirable to like do a thing that you love, but also be comfortable being like, this isn't working right now. And I'm okay with that feeling. But it's definitely like hard to be there in that space, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's endemic, right? I mean, you see this in the music industry, in the fashion industry. You see it with writers that have like a successful formula. You see it with artists, and at some point in time, you can become so deeply associated with your style that it ends up being a prison,
Mhm.
and that ends up being like a really terrible place to be. My friend Brad Vetter works out of Louisville, Kentucky, and really recognizable letterpress printer, does amazing work. Really loves to bring the digital and the analog together. So he has all these tools at his disposal and has such a distinct style. And I was talking to him just last year, and when we were having lunch, and we were talking about this exact thing. And he said, I made something I really loved the other day, and it was one of the best things that I felt like I had made in a long time, but it didn't really look that much like other stuff that I've made. And then I felt really sad because I was about to send it off to the client, kind of get it out the door. And I actually said to myself, like, does this look Brad Vetter enough?
Mm,
And I was immediately just like, oh, because you're really stuck at that point in time with this sort of like schizophrenia that happens. There's you in the real world that's produced this object that you're in love with. And then there's you that's the brand that everyone else sees. And you're trying to reconcile those two things. And it can become so complicated to reconcile those two things. And I think that I feel that pressure all the time. Sometimes it's leveraged by and sort of provoked by social media, where like I'll produce something that I really like, and no one will give a shit at
Yeah.
all. Honestly, just zero response. And then I'll produce something that's sort of in the niche of the things I've been producing, and it'll get the same solid response that it always did. And that's always kind of disappointing. It feels a lot like the band that puts out like the second or third album that they're
Mm.
super excited about,
Yeah.
and no one else gives a shit. They're just like, I couldn't care less. So I'm always into and amazed by artists that can reinvent themselves in really successful ways. We could take pop examples, right? Everyone from Madonna to Lady Gaga to Taylor Swift now, and say, I've had this sort of persona and this kind of output, and now I've been able to shift a little bit and swim, and then I have this persona and this output. But I think there's one thing that we forget about that. And I think this is incredibly important, especially for smaller and mid-level artists, is that they have not only the force of will and the sort of like financial resources and what I would consider structural resources, logistical resources to simply impose that on people. So I think it's important to remember sometimes when you see someone like Taylor Swift reinvent themselves, is to like look at that and say, did I really like that?
Yeah.
Or is there enough machinery like behind Taylor to make me think I like that now? And
Got
she becomes the arbiter of taste, just like Madonna and Lady Gaga and other things did. Now, for little people, it's way more complicated because you're making the thing that everybody likes, and all of a sudden you make something nobody else likes, and you simply don't have the fucking traction to enforce your will, or force your will on anyone else. And that, I think, for the people that are making a living off of art can be really troublesome too.
Yeah, because we don't have marketing teams. That's the thing, is there's no way
Yeah,
to like have an insight into the algorithm or have, some higher up who has secrets on how to like make something trendy and successful. And every young artist is sort of at the whim of the algorithm and whatever the people at Meta like want to gear their app towards.
yeah.
Um, which kind of sucks. I guess it's always kind of been the case that like societal norms have shaped art and vice versa, but it just feels like we're in a really pivotal time when that becomes more clear because of the technology that we're using. Um,
Yeah,
I
it's far
wanted,
more immediate now. You're right. And I think about this on like a personal level too,
right,
where imagine that I have a group of friends and every day I show up, I look like this and I have this hat and, my hair looks like this. And it's that way for 10 years, and then like one day I show up and I have like a crew cut and I'm dressed completely different. It doesn't even necessarily have to be an artistic pursuit. There can be these shifts in your own behavior or your own sort of aesthetic, and then you'll get a negative reaction from people, even those that are close to you. So if you just broaden that a little bit and think about it in the context of art, that's why it becomes so complicated. You have to imagine that even the people that love you would be shocked by a change. And now you have people that are just tangentially involved with you through art, and they're seeing that change too. They have less of a responsibility to even, buy into it than the
or be
people that
nice
love.
to you, or be like
Absolutely. That's the
forgiving.
thing. Yeah. And yeah, or be open at all to it.
Yeah. Um, I think you're really, well, you're an interesting person to interview for a variety of reasons, but I think I'm really interested in this kind of not collection, but like this experience you have of like interacting with so many different people in different shops and like kind of being able to not broaden your horizons, but like have this sort of like widened perspective of the field of letterpress, but also the field of art and like all these other life experiences you've had. I'm sort of interested in the how you had the chutzpah to like really create this community that you've done, because it can be really daunting to like you know try to connect with that's kind of what I'm doing here, like interviewing all of these different people, is like trying to really forge a community. And you probably know more letterpress printers than any other letterpress printer because of what you've been doing for the last decade. And I was sort of curious about that that element of your work and your interests and your personality.
I think that, as I said, maybe when I took off, I didn't envision that happening. I didn't envision being the sort of like connector. But then once I realized that that was going to be the case, I tried to embrace it as much as I could and realize that I was going to encounter so many different kinds of people and so many different personalities and so many different modes of working. But the one key part of this, I think, was staying in touch with everyone. So it wasn't just having it be this superficial connection where I bounced through once for 12 hours and then you never saw me again. That I would text you or I would email you. If someone had a question in the region, I would connect those printers in the region to one another. So I had to do all the legwork on the back end to keep that going. And I think that what I began to see is that in, again, like a really human way, that it paid off.
Mm,
People were just incredibly thankful. They would be like, oh, I had this press to restore and I had no idea what to do. And I'd connect them with the perfect person to restore it, and I think that I always talk about this, I think, when I speak in public, but just the idea that I learned right away that my whole trip that I thought was going to be about printing just ended up being about people.
mm,
And printing kind of like took a back seat right away. And that remains the case, to this day. I think I probably still keep in touch with 85% of all the people, that I visited their shops. So within, a month or a 2 month period, I'll connect with all of them or have a reason to. So I think that you're totally right. There's a lot of energy and time that's dedicated to that. But I think that I might have been, I can be a polarizing person, but I might have had the right personality for it too,
yeah.
because I'm pretty good at like mirroring people. So I think regardless of what their personality was like, I could feel comfortable in their space and they could usually feel comfortable around me. It's not that it's inauthentic, it's just that I try to spend a little bit of time understanding their perspective and where they're coming from. And then I try to be very direct about my perspective. So I think that's another thing. This isn't meant to sound as egomaniacal as it is, but I I think that it might not have worked for some other people.
Yeah.
They might have been, had the capacity maybe to interact with that many people. And that's not to say like all the interactions were great or perfect. I mean, there was a few where I was definitely like looking at my watch and being like, the fuck do I get out of this place? But then there were others where it's like I wish that I could stay 2 weeks instead of 2 days.
Yeah.
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 So I think that what you're doing in a lot of ways is really admirable because it's the same sort of thing, but I would say just from experience, um, to expect the payoff over years and not over weeks or months. It ends
Yeah.
up being something that really accumulates over time. It's not something that sort of like pays off in a month.
Yeah. I sort of envision this being a lifelong journey. What I mean, we might not have Zoom in 40 years, but I imagine I'll be doing this kind of work for a long time because you're right. It's like infinitely more rewarding than just being an artist in my own little silo. Like talking to people and getting to learn from everyone that I talk to is the most important part of being an artist or a designer or anyone in the artistic community. We only have a few more minutes, so I was wondering, you've had a sort of, even within letterpress, you've had this wide arc of experience from making art books and doing, small, I assume you were doing all the poems in lead type versus like some of the larger, more abstract stuff you do now. Um, what do you think you would tell yourself, like from 10 or 15 years ago when you were starting out the journey? What advice would you have for your younger self? Or would you not say anything? Would you just like let it happen?
When I first started the itinerant printer trip, my friend Tom said to me, this is like a huge thing that you're doing. We had a few like sit downs. He was just a little bit older than me, wasn't involved in printing or anything at all. Um, but he said to me, if you don't come back changed, you did something wrong.
Mm,
And I always like that, where he was really saying to me, like be open to the change that's going to happen. But if you get home and you're doing some sort of self-assessment and you really feel like you're exactly the same person, he really meant it. He meant like you're doing something wrong out there and you maybe need to take a look at that. So I think that even though this bred a lot of patience in me, which was something that I did not have before, and sometimes still don't. I have like a hockey temper sometimes, or it goes from like 0 to 1,000.
yeah.
seem super laid back, but I would tell myself that. I would tell myself to be more patient. Um, and I would probably tell myself too, especially for the people that were like close to me, I never really thought about how traumatic this experience could be to family and people who were like really close, like kind of in my inner circle.
Yeah.
And I would probably tell myself to be like kinder to them or understand that it was really difficult for them to, if I'm gone for months and months and months at a time, if our interactions are incredibly brief, or if they're somehow just centered around what I'm doing, which ends up being like really selfish. I think that I saw the upshot of that a lot, and I lost a lot of people and a lot of friends and things along the way. And I think that I would probably tell myself that. I would tell myself to be more patient with other people, but I would probably tell myself to be kinder to the people close to me. And probably like do what I could to do more for them.
Yeah.
I think that I ended up taking all those resources that you were talking about, whether they were emotional or they're physical or logistical or anything else, and I started giving those to this wider audience. It was the 1,000 or 2,000 people I had met, or the tens of thousands of people that I've spoken to on the road. That's kind of like where all of that was going. All of that currency was going to that space. And then it would come home and there'd be like nothing left for anyone else, you know? So I think that it would be a little bit more about trying to keep my battery charged in a really balanced way.
And that's good advice for all artists, not even just on the road, but just being an artist can often take all of your time and energy and patience. And then, you have to take care of the people who are taking care of you too. And I always forget that. Or not always, but I'm trying to be better about that too.
Yeah. And that's where I find myself now. I've always seen skateboarding and writing and artistic production and other things as a series of phase changes. And if you really look at chemical kind of phase changes, the way that they happen is through a series of plateaus. So it's like you build up a lot of energy in this plateau space, and then there's a phase change. And then there's another plateau where it's building up a bunch of energy, and then there's a phase change. And I would see that happen a lot of times in like skating and other things where I seemed like I was making no progress at all, and then all of a sudden I would make a lot. But right now I'm in one of those spaces where it's like I haven't honestly done anything that I would consider artistically important in 9 months or a year or something.
Well, I,
So
I would disagree, but we're out of time. So we'll end it there. And thank you for being on the show.
yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. Thanks for asking me.
Of course.